I'm now joined by TT senior government reporter Eugene Malero, who joined me on that interview with Mr. Buttigieg. Eugene Malero, we had a chance to sit down with the Secretary of Transportation for about 30 minutes. What was your impression of Secretary Buttigieg?
He's the type of transportation expert that really comes prepared, really knows his facts. And as somebody who covers the industry, you really appreciate somebody who is very, very well versed on the facts and figures. And when you and I pressed them on, the implementation of the infrastructure law, going back and really examining his answers, he gave us some frank, forward-looking responses, and that is very refreshing, especially when you interview a lot of people in Washington.
He was that's a good word, prepared, but very measured, though. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, exactly. He is just, a lot of people I was talking to about the secretary, everybody just agrees about how I call it media ready, but just, very comfortable in the spotlight, very comfortable, articulating these ideas. And, another takeaway that I had, Dan, was his ability to pivot from the really hard news, nuts and bolts, in the weeds, trucking provision, to taking a step back and still offer somewhat of an illuminating response to his sense of place, sense of awareness of where we are in the Biden administration. Because to be fair, this is, you hear the White House say this is a generational moment when it comes to transportation funding. And when you look at the rollout of a $27 billion funding availability to repair the country's bridges, that is, a once in a generation funding allotment. And, he's right in the center of it.
Eugene, that's a good point that you made, in that the secretary has a very deep bank account of money, government money, albeit, but he does have a lot of influence because of the fact that so much of the money that he's going to be dispersing over the next several years is coming directly from DOT.
Yeah. So when you total the numbers, you're looking at somewhere in the ballpark of $200 billion. This includes the annual congressionally approved funding for the department, as well as the injection of funds from this infrastructure law. So he is aware, his team are aware of the big injection of funds that they have at their disposal. And, not only the secretary, but other officials we've interviewed, the deputy secretary, for instance, they're really insisting. And even the White House infrastructure czar, Mitch Landrieu, recently was getting to this point that the U.S. Department of Transportation is gearing up to have a team with the state transportation agencies in order to facilitate access to these monies. And this is something that the White House, the Secretary of Transportation, and other officials at the department, their aim is to address these critical points of connectivity, not only at the commercial side when we're looking at supply chain, but also the commuter corridors, transit systems.
Eugene, we've got about 3.5 minutes before we go to break in this segment. Spend a couple of minutes explaining to our listeners how this interview came about. We have been working at it at Transport Topics almost since the date that the secretary became DOT secretary, with emails and phone calls and the like, but it came together relatively quickly within the last week or so. So go ahead and give the listeners a sort of a look behind the curtain.
Yeah, of course. We cover transportation. We have strong rapport with the leadership team, the media department at the US DOT. So myself, my colleagues, you included, we've gone back and forth with his office to have an opportunity to speak with him. My sense is that after the rollout of the Trucking Action Plan, this collaboration between USDOT and the Department of Labor, that the Secretary's office really wanted to get the Secretary out there more to articulate, to expand on this project, this collaboration. And his press team, some of them used to work on Capitol Hill. I've actually been working with them for several years. So we communicated over the holidays, and we worked on, trying to nail down a time. There was this big transportation conference called the Transportation Research Board annual meeting. So they thought that was going to be a good window of opportunity to give him media access for us, and then for our multimedia, for our radio platforms. So that's kind of the long story there, but just working the phones and just really staying on them to make him available, so he can speak to this a very specific audience that is very attuned to freight and commercial transportation issues.
And he has been out pretty aggressively in the last couple of weeks. You said TRB, that speech there, and then an event recently at the Port of Long Beach in Los Angeles. So his profile, now that the bill has been passed, has been ratcheted up quite a bit.
That's right. And another thing, Dan, critics of the administration and the president are really hitting them over the head with the supply chain disruptions. So the secretary and other members of the president's senior team, as well as the president, have been out there, doing counter messaging to, Secretary Buttigieg has been really adamant to emphasize that, the supply chain during the holidays were actually not this a nightmare scenario that, and then even the White House reminded people that something like 98% of packages were delivered. And as he told us, he actually responded directly to one of your questions, Dan, that they're not spiking the ball in the end zone just yet on the supply chain, that they recognize they have more work to do. But at the same time, Buttigieg, as well as people at the White House, are going out there to counter message, a lot of what you're hearing from House Republicans when it comes to the state of the supply chain.
Eugene Malero, our TT senior government reporter, joining us on the Newsmaker line, talking about our just completed interview with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. We'll be right back. This is Transport Topics Radio, Sirius XM Channel 146.
Welcome back to Transport Topics Radio with Dan Ronan.
We're back on TTR with Eugene Malero, our senior government reporter, who I had the pleasure of recently sitting down with and talking for, as you heard, about a 30-minute long interview with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, and discussing a whole variety of issues concerning the supply chain. Also, Eugene, we discussed the fact that within some of the sub-cabinet agencies, which are very important, there has not been a lot of movement in getting folks into those positions because of things being tied up in the United States Senate. In the case of Mira Joshi, she went up to New York, took a job as deputy mayor in Eric Adams' cabinet with him. So there's been a whole variety of things. There's not been a permanent leader at FMCSA for about longer than 2 years, back to Ray Martinez.
And he did not give us an update on the leadership over at FMCSA. The White House also has not announced a nominee to lead that agency, sometime this year. The agency is being led by a series of assistants who have been in the leadership role at the interim basis. But he did point to the fact that the Senate has confirmed some other senior people, most recently the administrator at the Federal Railroad Administration, and that, with his team as well as the team over for the Deputy Secretary, Polly Trottenberg, that they are ensuring that things run smoothly. That's something that, he really wanted to emphasize for us. And then, to be, for clarity, a key reason why some of these nominees were not confirmed last year was because there was some really significant Republican opposition over in the U.S. Senate, and this was led over concerns about the supply chain. So, ironically, had some of these transportation officials been confirmed, they would have been in a position to address the same concerns that these Republican senators were raising about the supply chain. But we can anticipate, having some announcements in the near term. But again, the secretary didn't get to that. But he did reassure us that the department is well staffed and they're standing up advisory committees and task forces, especially to proceed with the implementation of all these provisions of the infrastructure law.
Eugene, back June, July, August, there were a lot of folks, quite honestly, with hair on fire moments and hand wringing, oh, Christmas is going to be ruined, and people were out there trying to make political points for it. But for the most part, the supply chain held. It was severely challenged, especially in light of the fact that the two major retail reporting groups, the National Retail Federation and the MasterCard Spending Pulse, showed increases in the case of MasterCard well over 10%, in the case of the National Retail Federation, well over 10%, and in the terms of the MasterCard Pulse report, 8.5%. So there were a lot of goods moving through the supply chain the last several months, and it bended, but it did not break.
That's right. And, Secretary Buttigieg credits the Biden response team for some of that. He pointed to efforts by the White House Supply Chain Task Force to come in and facilitate these temporary access to what they call pop-up containers over at the Port of Savannah. He said that was actually, very productive to address these bottlenecks. And then the White House, did put in a lot of work in the ports of LA and Long Beach, working with the leadership structure there to, see and he did point out that this is the private sector that the White House was working with, so it's not that the White House had a direct say on, what these ports could do, but nevertheless, the White House came in, was working to ensure that some of these ports could, be operating around the clock, 24 hours a day, that there were some fee structures and penalty structures to see about enticing and motivating people to avoid penalties so they can move cargo, they can move their containers. And at the same time, I go back to a quote that he told us, Dan, which is that while he acknowledges that, Christmas was not ruined, that's my term there, that, quote, no one is spiking the football here, that he's quite aware that there's more work to be done. 2022 is likely to present a different series of challenges on the supply chain, and that's something that the White House has pointed to. But the secretary expressed a lot of confidence that the department is positioned in a way that they can respond, that they can be able to move money around and facilitate access to funds for ports and other commercial entities that need it. We already saw, some of the money that DOT has been allocating and providing for the freight stakeholders. We're talking about, $17 billion that will be made available for ports. We're, $5 billion and change for some of these bridges. That's going to be used for supply chain for bridges that are in the freight corridors, and money that go for safety grants at FMCSA. Well, that's the priority is to put money where it can facilitate the flow of freight. And, that's something that the White House is actually being very transparent about that a priority is to facilitate, the movement of freight and to alleviate these bottlenecks. And, that's something that the secretary really hammered home during our conversation, Dan.
One of the things also, Eugene, that was discussed, and I've raised this point as well, is that there's been a lot of criticism of the supply chain, and many in government have called for a more activist role to fix it. But the supply chain is by and large privately run. It's private industry. The trucking companies are privately owned and operated. They choose what routes to run, what lanes to run, what freight to carry. The railroads, the big class one railroads, are privately run. The ports, in many respects, are landlord ports where they own the property, but they have lease agreements with the shipping companies and the like. So this is the private sector doing its thing. And that's what a lot of folks in government want, and that is the private sector making the decisions on private sector initiatives.
Yeah, that's right. And, that's something that the secretary has emphasized. I've actually, he does interviews on the Sunday shows. I've heard him, really explain that to the moderators of the Sunday shows, this private sector presence of the players across the supply chain. The White House supply chain coordinator, his name is John Porcari. He routinely reminds reporters, that the private sector is the big player here on the supply chain, and that the supply chain, Dan, as you know, is not one thing. It's, many, many parts, a lot of players. And to that point, Dan, the secretary really emphasized the role that the trucking workforce plays in the supply chain, and his commitment to really go after the recruitment and retention concerns across the trucking industry. The number of 80,000 truck drivers, the shortage of truck drivers is something that he highlighted, and he, through various programs, primarily this apprenticeship to get in drivers younger than 21. And he also pointed to this Women in Trucking Advisory Board to recruit more women into the trucking ranks. That he has, the department is focused on trying to alleviate this trucking workforce concern. And they believe that doing so will ensure, just give more and more solid ground to the supply chain.
2 minutes left, Eugene. Let me ask you a question here. 5 years ago, Secretary Buttigieg was known in Indiana, and he was the mayor of South Bend, an important college town in north central Indiana. Now, 5 years later, he's the Secretary of Transportation. He's been a presidential candidate. How bright is his political future look at just now turning 40 years age? How bright is his political future?
He's one of those rare guys we've seen. To answer your point, the people that I talk to, especially political observers, they do see a very bright future for him. He knows his stuff. He comes prepared. Especially, we saw a lot of that during the presidential debates. He was very prepared on the issues, and he was very comfortable in a setting in which he had to debate colleagues and opponents of his views. So. I can see a place in which he continues to pursue elected office. If not, the White House, definitely somewhere in Congress or a state house. And this is, people that I talk to, they just routinely bring up his name. And especially as, we see this new generation of, Democratic leaders. He's definitely in the conversation of top 10 next, these rising stars in the Democratic Party.
Eugene Mulero, my TT government reporter colleague. Eugene, it was really a pleasure to work on this project with you, with Secretary Buttigieg, and to talk with you today about our conversation and give the listeners a little bit of a backstory about how it all took place. Eugene, thanks a lot.
You got it, Dan, and thank you for your hard work.
This is Transport Topics Radio on Sirius XM Channel 146.